image where blood glucose is normal at about 100 milligrams per deciliter. We eat something which spikes it up, right? And then this self-correcting feature brings the glucose back down to where we want it at the set point. All right, now let's talk about some homeostasis components. And these are basically structures that facilitate or that enable us to bring about homeostasis. So these are structures found in the body that are basically the players in the game of homeostasis. These are the ones that are going to bring about that signal and that change. There are receptors, also called sensors. There are integrating centers, which are usually in the brain. There are effectors. They're going to bring about the change. And then there are signals. So signals are basically forms of communication, okay, signals. Now in this image, we have a scenario of someone who's lying down, right, they're supine. And then they're going to stand up very quickly. And when you do that, when you stand up very quickly from a supine position, what happens is gravity causes a lot of our blood to pool into our lower limbs, okay? And that results in a drop in blood pressure in some parts of our body. Okay, so the blood pressure is going to fall as a result of us standing up, and we're not even aware of this as we stand up quickly. But the body's going to begin to automatically take steps to correct this. Okay, the first thing that's going to happen is that drop in blood pressure is going to generate it's a stimulus. It's going to generate a response, right? So it's going to send a signal to certain receptors that are found throughout the body, and that signal is basically you lost blood pressure, right? You have a drop in blood pressure. These receptors will then communicate to the integrating centers. And as you mentioned before, these are usually found in the brain, the medulla oblongata of the brain. This is like the command center, right? And so it's going to send that signal to the integrating center in the brain, and the brain is going to take that information in, process it, and generate a response that is going to be in the best interest of correcting that stimulus. Okay? So in this example of a drop in blood pressure, it's going to generate autonomic signals that are going to increase the heart rate, right? Increase the heart rate. And increasing the heart rate will in turn restore our blood pressure. Okay? So as a result of that initial stimulus, we now sent a signal to the brain, and the brain sent a signal down to an effector organ or an effector tissue, which is going to correct that initial stimulus. Now, when that initial stimulus is corrected, this is going to turn off that original stimulus. So when the blood pressure is then corrected here, this is going to feed back to the initial stimulus, and it's going to turn it off. We no longer need that signal. We no longer have that error signal, so to speak, okay? And as such, this creates a loop of events that is going to feed back onto itself. This is called a negative feedback loop. All right, so let's look at the details of some of those components. So we said receptors or sensors detect the stimuli. That's usually a change in one of the variables that we talked about. So they're going to pick up that change, and they're going to detect that something is off in a form of a stimuli. Examples of these receptors are the thermoreceptors, which are detecting the change in temperature, your chemoreceptors, which are detecting changes in chemical levels, and then your baroreceptors, which are detecting changes in pressure. Okay, so one of these three receptors will detect that initial stimuli and will report it. It's going to report it to the second component here, which is the integrating center. As you mentioned before, this is often found in the brain, and this is basically the control station. This part of the brain is going to be taking in information from these receptors and sensors and sending out responses to the effector. So it's going to be, question?
So when you have this up here, are we just automatically assuming, because on the one before there was a stimulus, we just automatically assuming there was a stimulus here?
Right, so the sensor is going to pick up the stimulus.
Okay.
So a change in temperature, a change in pressure, a change in the chemical levels is the stimuli. The structure is called a receptor, and that change is called the stimulus. Any other questions? So the integrating center is then going to bring about a response by sending a signal, a third component, going to communicate a signal either to the effector tissue, or the signal that's coming in is coming from the sensor. So signals can be of two types. Input signals are coming from the receptor to the integrating center, and output signals are going from the integrating center out to the effector. Okay, everyone get that? Any questions on that bit? And finally, the fourth component is the effector, right? The effector. Who's the player that's actually bringing about the response? In our scenario with the blood pressure, what was the effector? Can anyone remember? We said that someone stood up very quickly, their blood pressure dropped, a signal was sent to the brain, and the brain then sent another signal out, an output, to what organ? What was the effector? The heart. Perfect. So the heart was the example of our effector in the blood pressure scenario. Okay, now this can be any type of muscle in the body, smooth muscle of the gut, smooth muscle of the airway. It could be your skeletal muscle. It can be your glandular tissue to either increase secretions or decrease